Here we go. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to episode 1 of the Rob Breakenridge Show. Very excited to get started with this podcast. I've been waiting a long time to get back before a microphone. I don't want to dwell too much on the past. I will say, though, for those maybe not familiar with me or my background, my name is Rob Breakenridge. I've been in broadcasting and journalism for nearly 30 years now. For 21 years, I was a radio talk show host based in Calgary. I've also been writing a weekly column for the Calgary Herald for 17 years, as well as publishing in other outlets, including the National Post and The Line. I'd considered different names for this podcast, and maybe ultimately the name doesn't matter all that much. It's what you're able to deliver for your audience. The Rob Breakenridge Show title perhaps betrays my roots in talk radio, but in a lot of ways, I hope this can continue much of what we did over the years in terms of keeping you informed on what's happening here in Alberta, the West, and Canada-wide, sparking important conversations, and bringing you interviews with fascinating and relevant people. Now, 2025 has already been a rather eventful and consequential year, hasn't it? Between Justin Trudeau's resignation, Donald Trump's tariffs, Mark Carney's ascension, and the federal election that returned the Liberals to power, and now suddenly questions about national unity and Alberta's place in Confederation. Who knows where all of this is going, but it all definitely matters. And there is unfortunately a void when it comes to places and platforms to cover and discuss all of these issues. Hopefully I'll be able to help fill some of that void, and we'll get into some of these issues in this very episode. We've also got some great interviews coming up for you today. Andrew Coyne has written a new book. It's called The Crisis of Canadian Democracy. We'll hear from him shortly. Also, as Alberta is seemingly rushing headlong into a sovereignty referendum, we'll find out more about what's driving all of this, what it means for Danielle Smith, the UCP, and politics in Alberta. Derek Fildebrandt is publisher of the Western Standard. He has some unique insight and perspective on all of this. He'll join us later on in the episode. Plus, we'll discuss the legacy of one important prime minister and how the lessons from his tenure could be very relevant for Canadian leaders today. We'll hear from Bob Plamondon. He's author of the book Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker's Battle for Canadian Liberties and Independence. So all of that and more today on the Rob Breakenridge Show. Thanks for being with us. Let's get into it. Again, thanks for being with us, folks, on this first episode of the Rob Breakenridge Show podcast. I want to get to our first interview, a prominent voice and a highly regarded political thinker in Canada who has a dire warning about the state of democracy in our country. We are, of course, just coming off a transition from a prime minister's resignation, a new prime minister's ascension, and an election which produced yet another minority government for the Liberal Party of Canada. For as much as there is cynicism and frustration, I think, around elections, governance, democratic institutions in Canada, there is still maybe a belief that our system is strong. But our next guest lays out in great detail in his new book the deep challenges and dysfunction we face in our political system. It is a wake-up call, but also a call to action. Andrew Coyne is a columnist for the Globe and Mail, and he is the author of the new book, The Crisis of Canadian Democracy. Andrew, thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Always a pleasure, Rob.
It's been an eventful few months, obviously. The timing of the book is interesting. I'd imagine much of it was completed before the election and all of that. But is there anything you've seen over the last several months here that have either confirmed parts of your thesis or maybe changed or challenged some of it?
Well, I think I guess the most significant thing is here we are in the middle of this enormous crisis where we're dealing with suddenly hostile power to our south that we've always assumed was our best friend and protector. And Parliament's been dark for 5-6 months and nobody cares. Yeah. I think if you had any confirmation of the decline of Parliament, how little it is a part of people's mindset, how little significance they attach to it, I think the last few months would confirm that. And of course, all the shenanigans that went on before that, how we got into the situation where, the Liberal Party was absolutely united in its opposition to its own leader, but couldn't get rid of him because the power of the leader is so entrenched in our system. How he was able to leave the job, but not leave the job, prorogue Parliament for several months while they went about the business of choosing a new leader. All these things which are just completely flagrantly opposed to the principle of responsible government, where the government is supposed to be accountable to the Parliament every day of the year. It just is remarkable that we put up with it. But I guess one of the theses of the book is these things feed on themselves. We're so used to Parliament not mattering. We're so used to members of Parliament not mattering that we're not even aware of it anymore. It's hard to get people roused about it because they've forgotten why they should care.
Has that created cynicism? Is this a byproduct of cynicism? Is that part of the problem here?
Yeah, cynicism and complacency. We're a very successful country by any measure, and our democracy, in some ways, looks pretty good. We hold free and fair elections. Nobody's beaten up at the polling booth, and corruption and fraud are minimal. By these kinds of very formal procedural standards, we do pretty well. And I think it's kind of blinded us to the ways in which, in a more substantive way, but in a real and practical way, our democracy is falling short. So, yeah, we hold elections, and that's great. But the MPs that we elect to Parliament have really ceased to be any kind of serious representative for our ridings in terms of their ability to actually exercise whether your theory is they should represent what the riding constituents believe or whether you think they should be exercising their own independent judgment. They're not doing either. They're essentially representatives and foot soldiers for the party. And the Parliament as a whole is no longer able to really exercise effective oversight and accountability checks on the government of the day. We've seen this time after time after time with scandal after scandal on either liberal or conservative governments, where basically Parliament can't put a glove on them. And certainly in terms of the usual functions of debating and scrutinizing and subjecting legislation to the kinds of searching scrutiny that it's supposed to have, that's more or less ceased to function as well. So it's you could be forgiven for being cynical or just sort of shrugging at it and just forgetting why it mattered.
Well, in that sense, too, is it obvious that we're in a crisis? And that's the case you're laying out. But I think people assume that if we were in a crisis, it would be far more obvious.
Well, it's a slow motion crisis, perhaps. At one level, it's a crisis of legitimacy. That people don't see the Parliament as their Parliament. They don't see the government as their government. I think it's reflected in these appalling turnouts. We got a bit of a blip up in this recent election because of the crisis atmosphere around it. But generally speaking, the secular trend is down, down, down. Not only at the federal level, but provincial elections, you're now seeing turnout in the 40% range. Municipal elections even lower. In some by-elections, we've had turnout of 15%. So people are getting out of the habit of voting. Well, that has knock-on effects. We're dealing right now, for example, with provinces, not just Alberta, but other provinces, essentially passing flagrantly unconstitutional legislation. It used to be provinces demanded powers from the federal government. Now they just take them. They pass legislation that asserting powers that they don't have. Or certainly, when we see the continuing scandal 158 years after Confederation, that we still don't have a common market. Well, these are things that the federal government, that's why you have a federal government to deal with. But the feds don't feel they can because they don't have legitimacy. Because, as I say, people don't see that Parliament as their Parliament. They see it as Ottawa, that far off place they send MPs to and they're never heard from again. So the ability of the federal government to manage the federation is very much, I think, in a crisis mode, even at present. But now think about we're going forward. We're going to have to make a lot of very tough decisions. People understand this, that we've got to make real changes on our defense policy, on trade policy, on the economy. A lot of it driven by the crisis with the Americans. We have a system. We have an electoral system in this country that creates and exaggerates the real divisions within our country. So, for example, in Alberta this time, the Liberals got 30% of the vote, or near to 30% of the popular vote. That's the best they've done since 1968. But they only got 2 seats, as usual. And so it's easy to say, well, the Liberals have, they don't speak for Albertans at all, and why should we even listen to them? And they're just some alien foreign government. And of course, there's some truth in that. The Liberals over the years there's a reason why they have not paid a lot of attention to Alberta's interests and concerns, because they would say, because we can't win any seats there.
Right.
Or you flip around and you say, because they don't need to win any seats there, because they've racked up a majority in Alberta and Ontario and Quebec. That, again, is a function of the exaggerations and distortions of the first-past-the-post system, which rewards parties for agglomerating their vote in geographic terms. So we have a system, in other words, that creates a kind of a funhouse mirror distortion of the country. To look at the way in which the seats are counted, you'd think there were no Liberals in Western Canada. You'd think there were no Conservatives in Quebec. You'd think there were no Conservatives in the big cities. You'd think there were no Liberals in the rural parts of the country. And this is all of which is not true. But it encourages the very divisions that we're worried about. Well, to come back to my point about the concerns I have in the current situation, we've gotten by in the last few decades because of the divisions that our system is making worse by basically not confronting these issues. Because we know that if we ever did make these big changes and big policy decisions, we might have a rupture. Because what? Because why? What does that entail? It means a government with less than 40% of the vote, most of it in one part of the country, is supposed to ram through policy changes that might be repugnant to the other part of the country. And we know how damaging and divisive that can be. I'm very worried, even if the policies are good policies, I'm very worried in the next few years that we're going to be confronting these kinds of divisions. So yeah, it is a crisis.
And it's interesting. And you make the point there, because when we talk about democracy, and people might sort of equate democracy to the practice of going to the polls, or the way in which we elect a government, that's an exercise in democracy. But we're talking about in terms of Canadian democracy. It's all of it. It's the lead up to elections. It's the process of elections. It's the way in which governments are formed. Then, of course, it's the exercise of governing, the role of Parliament. It's all of that.
That's right. So, this book tries to tie together a number of different strands, a number of different problems, all of which there's abundant research on. People have written, could write more books about each one of them. But it's when you tie them all together and you look at it and you go, okay, none of the institutions and arrangements that we count on for our democracy is working in the way that it should. So the government is not really accountable to the House of Commons. The House of Commons is really kind of basically run by the government. The party leaders are not answerable to their caucuses. The caucuses are basically answerable to the leaders. The prime minister is not a part of a cabinet. The cabinet is basically an extension of the prime minister. So we've lost some of these really important accountability connections. And one of the points I try to make in the book is democracy is not just what happens on election day, it's what happens every day in between. So we have a lot of problems with our elections, as I've tried to suggest, in terms of our electoral system and how accurately reflects what we really want in when we vote. But it's even worse when you just think of the everyday work of democracy in between those elections, where we're simply not holding people to account. One example of that is the way in which we elect the party leaders. Used to be party leaders were elected by the caucus. That's the classic Westminster model. It's still in place in most other Westminster democracies in one form or another. We thought it would be a good idea back in 1919, the Liberals were the first to do it, to elect the leader by the party membership at large. And isn't that more democratic, getting more people involved? Of course, as it's evolved, it's not just the party membership, it's the party membership plus hundreds of thousands of instant members signed up in the course of the leadership race, which raises all kinds of problems on its own. But when you actually look at the practical effects of that, what it really means is the leader is elected by that, electoral college, if you will, of hundreds of thousands of people, most of whom just signed up for the race, most of whom are never seen again. They vote on that one day and they have nothing to do with the party afterwards. Many of them might have no interest in the party, might even be hostile to it. And after that, the leader's accountable to nobody. He can thumb his nose at the caucus for years at a time if he likes, because there's not much the caucus can do about it. Eventually, if it really gets horrific, if the leader is just, as we saw with Justin Trudeau, has to go, then you can spend 2 years trying to remove him. But good luck to you, because the leader has so much power that nobody wants to be the first to move. We saw this, right? Everybody was skulking around in the shadows because they didn't want to be the first to suffer the leader's wrath. So that is the problem. Is it looks more democratic to choose the leader that way. It turns out on a day-to-day basis to be much less democratic. You're basically imposing on the caucus a leader that they had no choice, no say in choosing, and then expecting them to follow where he leads. It just makes no sense whatsoever.
Well, and on that point, I mean, there are some provisions that now exist. I mean, the Conservative caucus, they decided that Erin O'Toole should no longer be the leader. So maybe some steps in that direction.
Well, that's right. So that was a result of the Reform Act, which was a private member's bill brought forward by Michael Chong, a reform-minded MP of the Conservative Party. He was only able to pass it in kind of watered-down form. But one of the things he was trying to address was this power of the caucus versus the leader. And he was able to get through a bill that said, if the caucus votes after an election to assume this power, along with some other powers, then they will have the power to remove the leader. And the first party to do that was the Conservatives. And when it came time to remove Erin O'Toole, who had gotten offside with the caucus on various matters, it was all done in 2 days. Yeah. And that was a watershed event. That puts every future Conservative leader on notice that if they cannot simply ignore the concerns and interests of the caucus. And you saw not a few Liberals in the dying days of the Trudeau government wishing they'd availed themselves of that power. We'll see whether they do in future. But that's definitely a hopeful sign.
So as you say, that's one element that has a longer history, but much of what you talk about and what you identify as the crisis is a more recent phenomenon. I mean, one example is just how we take for granted the governments are just going to ram through legislation, even large sweeping bills, omnibus bills, as we often refer to them, invoking closure, for example, something that once upon a time was kind of unheard of or almost scandalous for a government to do.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ways I try to explain this to people is, let's think of the various things that we think we elect MPs to do, the things we elect them to do, to debate legislation, to scrutinize legislation, to propose legislation, ultimately to pass legislation, to vote on it. Well, okay, they can debate legislation, as you say. It'll be pretty rote. Nobody's minds are changed. These days, a lot of times the speeches are written for them. But in the crunch, if the debate is ever likely to go anywhere, the government has the power to invoke a time allocation, which is the sort of softer version of closure, but pretty much amounts to the same thing. And in recent years, certainly under majority governments, that would describe half the bills passed, is they were passed with the use of time allocation. As you mentioned, that used to be incredibly rare. One of the biggest fights in Canadian history, the pipeline debate in 1956, was fought because the government invoked closure in peacetime, and people were scandalized. This had not happened in 20 years. Now it happens every other day, and nobody bats an eye. So there's an example where MPs are simply not performing the role assigned to them. Scrutinizing legislation, again, if you're putting forward these omnibus bills where you're yoking together dozens of different bills of completely different subject matter and forcing MPs to vote all of them together up or down, how can you know, first of all, what MPs intended on any piece of that monster package? But secondly, how can you give proper scrutiny to a bill that's 800 pages long? It's ridiculous. Right. And yet that's become, certainly with omnibus budget bills, that's become the norm under both parties. Proposing legislation, most MPs will never see a bill that they sponsored pass into law. About 3 of them do a year. Private members' bills have just ceased to be any kind of serious part of the legislative agenda. And finally, voting on legislation. Study by the Samara Center found that MPs vote with their party 99.6% of the time. The biggest maverick voted against his party, I think it was 3% of the time. This not only is this worse than it was in the past, but it's way different than in other countries. All countries have a high degree of party discipline, but we've taken it just to extraordinary lengths. In the British Parliament, 1 in 5 MPs votes against their party or breaks with their party at least 2% of the time. In our Parliament, only 1. So you can see how we've taken party discipline just to an absurd extent.
Well, it's interesting. And part of it is the convenience for government of just, not having to bother with these things, the concentration of power in leaders' offices. But to that point, I wonder how much of this reflects kind of a hyperpartisanship that exists in this era where you have to be loyal to your party. You have to crush the opposition, that it's, the stakes are raised and there's no room for disloyalty, or else you're one of them to some extent. Is that an element here?
Sure, but that is largely a function of leadership control. When MPs, when your view is simply whatever the view of the leader is, then you're no longer conducting politics on the basis of ideological differences. Tribalism is basically what takes over.
Yeah.
Because your fight with the other guys isn't necessarily that you disagree with them. You might agree with them, or you might have a principled disagreement with them, but when it's just simply say and do whatever the leader tells you to do, then that replaces substantive differences and it just becomes pure tribalism. So some of the nastiness of our politics is a function of the emptiness of it. And the emptiness of it is a function of it being entirely driven and controlled by the leaders. I should say, we talked about the leader is no longer chosen by the caucus, but even worse is the caucus is basically chosen by the leader. They're chosen in literal terms when they seek the nomination, in that more than half of them are simply appointed. We think we have a system in which nominations are won in competitive local riding association races. Well, that describes only about 1 in 5, less than 1 in 5 races now, or ridings now. In most of them, they're either appointed by the leader or they run unopposed, meaning everybody knows they're the choice of the party establishment. And even where there is a contested race, there's all kinds of shenanigans that have become, I think, more and more a matter of concern, because it used to be, okay, they stacked the meeting, they brought in busloads of instant members, shenanigans. Now we know that's a really important vehicle for foreign interference. Right. And so it's become less funny. It was always bad, but it's become really serious now when we can see what's happening. But the fact that the leader basically has a veto on the nominations of every MP, including sitting MPs, that they have to get the leader's approval to stand for Parliament, just gives it's one of the many powers the leader has over them, and that's why our politics have become so completely leader-centered.
And the fix then, if there is one, I mean, we mentioned the Reform Act, which was maybe some baby steps in this direction, but otherwise, I mean, we saw Justin Trudeau's very cynical promise on electoral reform, and that kind of imploded, and maybe that's dead. And the idea that party leaders or prime ministers are going to give up this power seems like a big ask. So are we stuck in this?
Well, it's a real question. So as you say, the conundrum, the catch-22 in any reform proposal is the people who would have to enact those reforms are the people who benefit from the system as it is now, the people who got there as a result of that system. So you can talk about, there's a lot of good reforms that have been proposed. For example, to move some of the powers that are now the prerogatives of the prime minister to decide when debate should end, for example, to give that to the speaker. Or to take powers that are, again, the preserve of the prime minister to decide when to dissolve parliament, for example, and make the subject of a vote of supermajority of parliament. So there's various proposals, pardon me, to distribute some of these powers, but ultimately the prime minister would have to agree to that. Does that make the system hopeless? I don't think so, but it means that probably reform will only happen in one of two ways. One is the kind of incremental thing, starting with things like the Reform Act, where, right now we're caught in a lot of vicious circles where Parliament is weak because nobody cares about it because Parliament is weak. Why should we give more powers to MPs? Because they're such peons and nobodies. But if MPs start to acquire powers, if you can get the ball rolling, and one of the signal powers to give them is the power to remove the leader, then that perhaps can start to take on its own momentum. That the newly empowered MPs will start feeling a little friskier and will start thinking about other powers that they think they ought to have. And that would be a very useful development. So there's some glimmer of hope perhaps there. I wouldn't want to overstate it. But the other way is you just get into such a crisis again, possibly because of national unity concerns, that eventually people say, okay, I think we've gotten into such a state, we've got nothing to lose now about thinking about more systemic reforms. And so, and that's, as I say in the book, that's how we got Confederation. They were so deadlocked, and the system was clearly not working. And eventually, sworn enemies decided to line up together because there was no alternative. They had to embrace more systemic reform, and we may get to that situation.
It's interesting too. I mean, we've had now successive minority governments, and maybe there was some hope that even with the instability that brings, that it might change some of this. It might give MPs more leverage or make governments more conciliatory. But I don't know if we've actually really seen that.
It's hard to say. It's certainly, we're certainly becoming used to it. This is the sixth election in the last 8 that's produced a minority parliament. So if the argument for first past the post is, it produces the firm smack of authority, say what you will about it, at least we get majority governments, that's not actually the case anymore. We'll see whether, this election, there seemed to have been a trend towards a two-party system, and we'll see whether that continues, but I doubt it. I think the tendency towards multi-parties is pretty entrenched in Canadian politics, and when you've got multi-parties, first past the post really doesn't work. So, minority parliaments, there's at least a little more hope for holding governments to account. When you have a majority government, this election, my main thing was I didn't want any party to have a majority, because when you have a majority government with majority control of the committees, it means it's impossible to have any accountability. Majorities plus rigid party line voting, the party leaders control the committees, have complete control of the committees. So that instrument of accountability is just basically washed out. That's never to anybody's benefit. But it hasn't yet produced, as you say, a surge in MPs asserting themselves. But we'll see. Maybe if we keep doing it, maybe people will realize.
Indeed. Well, the book is out now. It is called The Crisis of Canadian Democracy, and much more from you, of course, at theglobeandmail.com. Andrew Coyne, always a pleasure. Thank you so much for the conversation here today. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Rob. I enjoyed it very much.
Our thanks once again to Andrew Coyne. Again, his new book, The Crisis of Canadian Democracy, is available now, published by Sutherland House Books. Now, let's discuss, we have a government that faces a litany of major challenges. There is, of course, as we chatted with Andrew, the whole question of how our democracy, our democratic institutions function. There are the major economic challenges facing this country right now, exacerbated by the trade wars and tariffs instigated by the Trump administration. And there's a question of national unity, in particular, the whole situation here in Alberta. There is the frustration, once again, that what Alberta wants and what the rest of the country wants seems to be so different and disconnected. There's the frustration, once again, that our concerns, our objections to federal policy, our aspirations and hopes will once again be disregarded or take a back seat to those of other, perhaps more important, provinces or regions. That's the perception here, at least on the part of many Albertans. We shouldn't ignore or downplay that, even if the whole idea of separation seems extreme or unrealistic. We'll talk a bit more in a few minutes about where the sentiment is coming from, where things are likely going in the weeks and months ahead. But as mentioned, the federal government faces many huge and important challenges, and we do need some bold and competent leadership to rise to the occasion. The first week was not encouraging. A new cabinet was sworn in, which included many faces linked to the failures of the past or those who serve as reminders of poor decisions and missed opportunities of the past. We have the new housing minister, for example, struggling to articulate whether the government actually believes that there is a need to bring down housing prices in order to address affordability. The new housing minister also happens to be the former mayor of Vancouver, where housing affordability is perhaps more of a mess than anywhere else in Canada. So it was an inauspicious start on that file, to say the least. And then we had Stephen Guilbeault, a toxic political figure in Alberta, if ever there was one, perhaps even on par with his former boss. Guilbeault has, mercifully, been moved off of any portfolio having to do with energy or the environment, yet it seems like he just can't help himself. Despite signs from Prime Minister Mark Carney that his government will be more open-minded to the need for new energy projects and infrastructure, including pipelines, along comes yet another minister to undermine that message. Guilbeault said this last week when he was asked about the possibility of new pipelines in Canada.
People should remember that we bought a pipeline, Trans Mountain, and that is only used right now about 40% capacity. So I think before we start talking about building an entire new pipeline, maybe we should maximize the use of existing infrastructure. And the Canadian Energy Regulator, as well as the International Energy Agency, are telling us that probably by 2028, 2029, demand for oil will peak globally, and it will also peak in Canada. So as far as I know, there are no investors right now. There are no companies that are saying that they want to build an east-west pipeline. And as you know, these things are built by companies, not governments.
Now, first of all, Guilbeault was completely wrong when it comes to the current capacity of the Trans Mountain expansion project. It's actually running closer to 80% right now. And secondly, if folks like Stephen Guilbeault had their way, there probably wouldn't be a Trans Mountain pipeline expansion in the first place. Look, it is true that we don't face an immediate capacity crunch as we did prior to TMX coming online. And it's also true that we could more easily create new capacity by expanding existing pipeline infrastructure like TMX itself or the Enbridge mainline, for example. And perhaps the priority right now should be on expediting LNG projects and capitalizing on those opportunities. It is ironic, though, that Guilbeault, in his capacity as the new Minister of Canadian Identity, is so clueless and tone-deaf when it comes to certain parts of Canada, Alberta especially. Now, Guilbeault is obviously not the final word on any of this, and we should put much more stock in what the Prime Minister says and does. But Guilbeault is playing into the hands of those pushing a separatist agenda in Alberta. And one would hope he'd be astute enough to avoid doing so. This is certainly not helpful right now. As for Alberta's Premier, who finds herself in a very awkward position right now in the midst of all of this, here's what Danielle Smith had to say about the need for new federal policy and what could happen if the Carney government doesn't meet her demands.
I know that the federal government is seeking input on projects that might qualify for a fast-track process. And so that's what I'll be looking at as an indicator of whether the federal government is going to meet us partway. Because the project I've put on the table is a revival of the Northern Gateway pipeline to Port of Prince Rupert. Because when you look at that particular route, it gives us access to all the Asian markets and gives us a preference of being able to get our product there over any country in the world. We've got 8 days or 10 days to South Korea and to Tokyo, and then going on to the east coast of India and all the other nations in between. And so being able to create new markets there with additional export of bitumen is going to be incredibly important. Some of the biggest refinery in the world of heavy oil is in India. There are 4 Korean refineries that have already received shipments of Trans Mountain heavy oil, and they like it, and they want more of it. So what does that mean? Well, they'd have to have a fast-track process to approve that pipeline, so we're not waiting 10 years, and so that it is de-risked to a point where somebody will come along and build it. And if you're going to have that pipeline end at Port of Prince Rupert, well, you're going to have to do a carve-out on the tanker ban so that we can load it onto a boat and get it overseas. And if you do all of that, then you're going to probably have to take the ties off of our energy industry to talk about how we're going to reduce our emissions without facing criminal penalty, because right now that's called greenwashing under their Bill 59. And to be able to get support, we'd have to talk about the Pathways Project and how we might be able to decarbonize the production. And that means no emissions caps, because if you want to increase your export, you can't have an emissions cap which acts as a production cap. And on top of that, we have a framework for how our carbon emissions are priced, which we've been doing since 2007. And we've heard you can't go above $100, otherwise it's going to create an economic environment where people won't invest here. So that means they can't layer on their own carbon tax regime. So those are like 5 things right there that they would signal to me that they were serious about changing things if they agreed to the Port of Prince Rupert revival of Northern Gateway or something like it. So that's what I'm looking for.
If we can't get that, which is, as you say, a very specific, hands-on project, if that can't be accepted and what goes along with that, what do you think the reaction of Albertans will be to that if it is rejected, and what do you think that means for Confederation?
Well, let me answer in a very practical way again, because I know that there are several projects that are being floated to the U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Doug Burgum, that would get more of our oil and gas out of Alberta and into the United States. And then I would say to my colleagues again, what do you think it's going to do to national unity that it's easier for Alberta to get its product traded to the United States than through British Columbia or through Eastern Canada? And then we're going to have that conversation, because that is the problem that we have right now, is that we all have stronger ties north-south than we do east-west. And so I'll be looking at that as an indicator of whether words were said just to win elections, or whether words were said because we're serious about trading with each other and supporting each other. And we're serious about finding new markets for our products. So I think we'll know pretty soon, Rick, about whether or not we're going to have to switch our focus to continuing to expand our relationship with the United States, or whether our neighbors are going to be serious about not just having us on Team Canada, but Team Canada being on Team Alberta.
And what both Smith and Guilbeault and others tend to gloss over when it comes to pipelines is that governments don't build or decide to build pipelines. Smith is right when she identifies the need to remove obstacles that discourage the private sector from making those investment decisions, something Guilbeault still seems kind of oblivious to. But for example, there is no company presently proposing to build Northern Gateway or something like Northern Gateway, so it's unfair to expect the federal government to greenlight something that is, for now, hypothetical. I do think there is still some room for compromise between Alberta and Ottawa and the ability to move forward on some of these important issues. Perhaps that comes as too little too late for those who have written off Canada altogether. There is a real push right now for an independence referendum, and given what the Premier has proposed with regard to changes around the mechanism to provoke such a vote, it feels like it's almost inevitable. The vote, that is, anyway. I would expect Albertans to vote to remain in Canada, but I wouldn't sit here and guarantee that. Of course, there's all the uncertainty and volatility that comes with such a campaign. It all feels very unpredictable right now. Our next guest has some interesting insight and perspectives on all of this. Derek Fildebrandt is former MLA here in Alberta. He is the publisher, president, and CEO of the Western Standard, westernstandard.news. Derek Fildebrandt, so great to have you with us here today. How you doing?
I'm great. It's been a long time since you and I have been on a show together, and so thanks for having me on your inaugural show. Good luck.
Well, I appreciate that. Lots to talk about, obviously. I do want to start with a story that the Western Standard, I think, first broke about the upcoming by-election in Olds, Didsbury, Three Hills. Now, it's kind of ironic in a way because it was a by-election in Olds, Didsbury in 1982 where a separatist MLA was briefly elected. Maybe the UCP not taking chances this time around, appointing a candidate. What does it tell you about where things are at right now?
A few things. So I know, the constellation of independence parties that are out there are licking their chops at the chance to make history repeat here. This constituency might be the most famous constituency in Alberta for the fact that in 1982 it elected an MLA in a by-election from the Western Canada Concept Party, which isn't around anymore, but it's kind of a forerunner to many of the independence parties that are out there today. So Nathan Cooper was appointed. He was the Speaker of the Legislature. He was appointed to be Alberta's trade representative to Washington. This seat holds so much symbolic value. So all these independence guys are going to want to contest it. I thought it was so. The leader under the UCP's rules, the leader's got the right to appoint candidates, and I think there are some, there's some legitimate uses of that. There's some illegitimate uses of it. Which side of that you fall on depends on if you like the candidate or not. For the most part, do you like the outcome of it? I thought it was a curious decision to appoint because Danielle Smith has been trying her damnedest, and I think so far pretty successfully, to keep the independence issue an intramural affair, that the UCP is now the biggest of possible tents, where you've got federalists and nationalists inside of the same party fighting over not the curriculum or a marginal tax rate, but over an existential question. So that's a tough, tall order to begin with. She's trying to keep it an intramural affair. So I thought this would be a pretty good opportunity for them to have a big open nomination And very clearly there would be some independence candidates and some federalist candidates and some people trying to walk a finer line in the middle, duking it out. And that would be sure to keep it an intramural affair. I guess the other side of that argument would be it would be very divisive, having UCP members in a mega nomination in a guaranteed super safe conservative seat, duking it out on very clear, it's not like kind of red Tory, blue Tory lines, but on such a clear issue as independence. So I guess maybe it would have been divisive, but it now opens up the possibility of it being divisive outside the UCP. The question is, has Danielle Smith, by making the independence issue, non-legislative, by lowering the bar on citizens' initiative, is that enough to keep these folks happy? It's an open question.
Yeah, it is, and I think it's going to be interesting. I mean, as you say, there have been various iterations of independence parties. There now seems to be, I guess, sort of coalescing around this Republican Party, the Alberta Republican Party. But I don't know. I mean, is this an opportunity for them to make a splash? Is it any kind of a commentary on anything if they were to get like just 5 or 10% of the vote?
Mm-hmm. There's a lot of them. So there's the Republican Party, which used to be called the Buffalo Party, right. Changed the name. A lot of these parties change their names fairly frequently. I've been involved in the cottage industry of them myself. There's the Wild Rose Independence Party, which during the Kenney cycle became by far the most prominent. It actually got up into the low 20s in percentage of support at some point. It actually started creeping up on them, even though it had no money, no leader, nothing. Then there's the Wild Rose Loyalty Coalition, which is not a discount card at the gas station. It is another political party, Alberta Advantage Party, Alberta Independence Party. There's a bunch of them. In the last Alberta election, the Wild Rose Independence Party pretty much parked itself intentionally and just said, Smith might be the best we can get, so let's actually give her a chance. And they stood down. It's not like they had a lot to lose, so maybe that made sense. Right. The Republicans don't seem to be doing that. They're much more antagonistic. They seem to have a very specific problem with Danielle Smith herself, and there's a lot of internal politics around that. Alberta politics is a small town. I know pretty much everybody involved on both sides of this stuff. If they have an opportunity, this is it. The candidate that Smith has appointed there, I think it's Tanya Sawyer, or last name Sawyer. She seems to be a pretty good candidate. Maybe Smith is also hoping to bring in some cabinet material. When she became premier, she didn't have a lot of time. She did not, to my surprise, purge the caucus of a bunch of Kenney supporters. A lot of them had already, by hook or crook, had their nominations locked in. So she hadn't brought in a lot of her own people. So there's maybe some case for cabinet building for her to want to appoint as well. But by not having that open nomination, which would have been a very divisive process in this particular case for this particular riding and this particular issue, she has perhaps given an opening for the Republicans. I would be shocked if it's anything but a thumping UCP victory. Right. But I wouldn't be shocked to see 5 or 10% of people who probably still want the UCP to win to want to throw a rhetorical grenade and vote Republican, just to kind of send a message that we mean business here.
Yeah, I mean, it should be a safe seat, but I mean, it sort of speaks to this point that things have shifted and shifted since the federal election. And let's take a step back and look at what this all means or how real this all is, because in a way it feels like, well, we just had Justin Trudeau and it wasn't bubbling over like it is now. But is that because maybe everyone just sort of thought, okay, this guy's going to be gone, they're going to get their comeuppance, something's going to change? Like, what has set it off now, do you think?
Well, for 2 years, we've had polls showing the Conservatives first winning a big majority and then a record-breaking super mega majority. Right. I don't know how loaded I can make that term, but like winning virtually everything in every part of the country. And so that provided a very clear light at the end of the tunnel for people. Alberta nationalism, or the independence movement, however you want to call it, it's a unique beast. It's not an ethnic, linguistic, or religious nationalism, the way you'd see with Quebec, Catalonia, Scotland. In some ways, although it's not apples to apples, it's it's more comparable to Bavarian nationalism, and a lot of people don't know a lot about that. But Bavaria has had in Germany has had separatist leanings. Never actually, obviously, separated since the 1870s. But it's seen its thing as its own thing, not because they don't see themselves as German, but because they see themselves as more German, and the rest of Germany isn't German enough. And I think that's how Alberta, in very large measure, sees itself. Alberta doesn't see itself as not Canadian. I think it sees Alberta as so damned Canadian, and the rest of Canada has lost its sense of being Canadian. And in a weird kind of way, Alberta can be more Canadian by being on its own. So if there is hope of a rah Canada conservative and more friendly to Western economic development candidate, Albertans are going to go on that. This movement. I don't think Alberta's problems get solved by a conservative government. I think it means we get screwed a little less terribly, and at least Ottawa says thank you when they do it. When they leave the room and shut the door, they say thank you. But for most Albertans, that would have taken the wind out of the sails. This would have gone absolutely nowhere for 4 to 8 years if Poilievre would win. But that light at the end of the tunnel is gone. And Carney, I think people were ready to go pretty much as soon as Carney got elected for the 4th Liberal term. But there's enough people in the middle that were like, well, let's give the guy a chance. He says he's different. Let's see. It's still very early days, but it doesn't appear that this is the radical change that Carney has promised.
Well, no. And I mean, Stephen Guilbeault is kind of a gift, I think, to those who want Alberta to leave, and having him front and center, as we saw just a few days ago, that's not helpful, I guess, in that sense.
Well, he's the leader of the independence campaign in Alberta, unofficially.
Pretty much. It is interesting because in a lot of ways, I mean, for a conservative premier in Alberta, having a liberal government in Ottawa is politically useful, right? But something has kind of changed where, as much as it is in some ways beneficial to Danielle Smith, it's taken on something else where maybe this is a little bit outside of Danielle Smith's control. And it goes back to something we talked about earlier. So how different is her situation now as opposed to, when Jason Kenney came in and was dealing with Justin Trudeau?
Well, there's a few things. One is Kenney, while he's never said it out loud, you could just never shake the sense that he always had his peripheral vision on going back to Ottawa, that he was never going to go and never do or say anything that would irreparably make it impossible for him to eventually become prime minister one day. With Danielle Smith, I don't think anyone of sound mind believes that she has ambitions to be a federal politician someday. Right. That seems genuine, so I think she's got more credibility on that side. Kenney was an unconditional federalist. And, so in Smith's address of, I think, roughly 4th or 5th of May, she kind of broke Alberta down into kind of 3 broad groups. There are she talked about, the sovereignists or who want independence, the nationalists. She talked about then the unconditional federalists. I think that's pretty much the term she used, more or less. And then she said, and then Albertans like me, in the middle, who want to make it work. But I took from that, she put herself in a different category than the, quote, unconditional federalists. Yeah. Meaning that, she's not on the independence train right now. But is there a point at which she could be? I pressed her on this on an interview earlier this week. She didn't bite. And she tried to pivot a bit. I'd come back to it. She didn't bite. But taking from her own statements, she's not a full nationalist, but neither is she an unconditional federalist. We've got some polling we're releasing just today. Again, I always ask how you ask this question. If you ask about separation, support for leaving is lower than if you ask about independence. The way I always put it, it's you go to the singles bar and say, you can say, hi, I'm newly divorced, or you can say, hey, I'm single. It might mean the exact same thing in the context, but it has a very different implication. One sounds a lot more positive and forward-looking than the other does. And so anyway, it had independent support at 45%. I thought that's on the high end of what we've seen so far. So I actually asked the pollster to go back and get a bigger sample size, and the results held up. We'll see how other pollsters measure up to it as well. But we commissioned Main Street, a pretty reputable and often even kind of liberal-leaning polling firm. We commissioned them during the Kenney years, and at its height, Alberta independence got to 45%, depending on how you ask the question. Actually, in that question, we asked, should Alberta leave if it goes along with British Columbia and Saskatchewan? So that's maybe the most positive way to ask the question. So you're going to get a higher result on that. But so I don't mean to be the politician to answer in your question. So come back to this. Smith is also keenly aware that no Alberta Conservative premier has finished one single term. Right. Since Ralph Klein in 2004. I was in high school the last time an Alberta Conservative premier finished one term. Rachel Notley may have been one and done, but at least she finished her term. Jason Kenney, Alison Redford, Ed Stelmach, none of them have finished one single term. I've predicted that Smith would be probably the first to do it. She's in very dangerous waters here, but I think this actually does increase her chances of staying. I'll tell you, if she had just merely said, I'm going to have a panel, and I hear you, but there is no possible outlet for the independence movement to move other than a new party. One of two things, or possibly both, would have happened. That new party would have broken in and actually made a real would have completely destroyed the UCP's sense of unifying the right. Or two, she would have been overthrown as leader of the UCP. She's very, very aware that it happens literally every time in the last 20 years. Some of this, I think, is politics. Yeah, maintaining the unity of the party and the government. But, perhaps she also just genuinely believes that this is the right thing to do. She's talked about the need for citizens initiative back when she was working on the Calgary Herald's editorial board with my opinion editor, Nigel Anniford, back when she was on QR with you. So that's not new policy for her. Just the timing is obviously maybe a little less than coincidental that legislation's being amended to the point where it's actually usable now.
Yeah. Well, and I assume you agree. It feels like it's going to happen. Like it feels like there's now an inevitability to this. Now there's the question of when and what happens between now and then. I think Danielle Smith would rather this be next year, and maybe we end up seeing an early election in some capacity too. Like put this off and deal with some of these issues in the meantime. If it happens sooner, it's a little more volatile perhaps, but clearly those who are pushing for this, they want it sooner. So your thoughts on the inevitability and when this is likely to happen?
It's inevitable now. I think citizens initiative legislation is a generally positive thing. It doesn't always work out positive, and that's politics. Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. I think the threshold should be high enough so that we're not voting on 99 propositions like California every couple of years. But it shouldn't be so high that it's literally, for all intents and purposes, impossible to actually use, like Saskatchewan still is and Alberta's was until like yesterday. So if there is a particularly burning issue that can motivate and animate people like this, that it can be put to a ballot. The premier in her address of May 4th or 5th, she said that this would likely happen in 2026, very likely alongside some other referendum questions. Yeah. I'm not actually sure having those other referendum questions on the ballot helps the independence cause, because it might allow people to say, okay, fine, I'm going to vote for everything else, and that's going to send a message. So I actually think that might actually hurt the independence.
The pension plan thing.
Yeah. So by putting that stuff on, it's you can vote for pension plan, you can vote for all police force or whatever happens to be on that ballot. It might allow people to vent without actually clicking yes. Yeah. So I think that potentially hurts it. I think we're looking at 2026. The legislation, I think, leaves some discretion to the cabinet about when the vote actually gets held. So, if this thing was submitted today, I don't think we see it take place during the municipal elections. I don't think that's good, regardless of what side you're on. An issue like this should be debated very thoroughly and rigorously. There are many on both sides who just, independence is a panacea, and they don't want to debate any of the details. That's wrong. And then, a lot of the unconditional federalists who say any discussion of this is treasonous, and Alberta would be Kazakhstan if it was on its own. So I think we need time. Not that I'm expecting a lot of nuance. That's just not the way political debate works at the best of times, let alone 2025. But I think time for us to vet the issues and dig into it, for people to really consider this, so that, I want a yes vote. I want a successful independence vote, but I don't think people should vote just on a knee-jerk reaction. We're pissed off about one election cycle. You don't declare independence because of an election cycle. Maybe that's the catalyst that finally lit the fuse to make this happen, but it shouldn't just be, we lost an election, I'm taking my ball and going home. It needs to be a much bigger, more considered decision than that.
Getting back to Danielle Smith, and you mentioned, how she sort of positioned herself in the middle between these two sides. And I mean, once we get into a referendum, there are going to be two sides, and presumably those will have leaders or kind of public faces. And no one's really declared that. But let's say, hypothetically, you've got, Preston Manning, Stephen Harper on one side, or Jason Kenney, or people like that. And that leaves Danielle Smith nowhere. I mean, how does Danielle Smith survive or have credibility if in the midst of all of this, she's on the fence or she runs and hides?
Mm-hmm. I think it's going to be, I've written about this. I think it's going to be very difficult for her to stay neutral to the end. She's trying to play, be both good cop and bad cop, Yeah. I mean, at the end of the day, it also depends on, what's in her heart. She has said, there's 6 months for them to meet the demands she's laid out to Carney. I actually thought these demands were pretty low-hanging fruit. There was no constitutional change in there. Like, Albertans are treated as second-class citizens. Albertans and people in Saskatchewan, and to an extent British Columbia, are treated as second-class citizens in representation in the House of Commons and in the Senate. There's no talk about fixing any of that, because then Quebec comes and they'll talk about a bunch of French stuff. So there's no constitutional issues on the table. This is all pretty achievable legislative stuff that if Carney was interested in keeping Alberta and Saskatchewan and Canada, he would meet. Some have said, these are impossible demands. She's setting it up to fail. I really don't see it. I think these are achievable. They're big changes. They're substantive, but they're very achievable. There's no constitutional changes required for any of it. If at the end of that, I asked her the interview just the other day, if the 6 months run out, you said the status quo will not continue. Well, what if the status quo does continue and the time has run out and we're now staring down the barrel of the independence vote? What would you do? And, she just said, well, I hope that won't happen. So I didn't get a clear answer. It's going to be hard for her. We're looking at hosting debates in both Alberta and Saskatchewan on this issue. We're going to be inviting the NDP leaders in both provinces. I'm actually thinking of the debate's going to have probably two people on each side, because the independent side is pretty much uniformly conservative. The Federalist side has got, the left in both provinces is uniformly Federalist, but there's also a minority of conservative voters in both provinces that are also Federalists. So it's going to be impossible for her, I think, to stay out of this completely. In the end, I think she's going to have to take a side. I don't think she has to right now, but in the end, she's going to have to. Especially, if this is going to get over the line. Be interesting, if we're at a 50-50, or we're down to Quebec 1995, and it could go either way. The premier's weight, one way or another, would move it at that point. So the balance of Alberta is going to be in her hands potentially.
I mentioned two other names. I mean, Jason Kenney has some more recent political baggage in Alberta, but Stephen Harper, and I don't know where Stephen Harper's at on this, or if he wants to be the face of Canada, but would he be a game changer, do you think?
I've talked about this in our newsroom before. Our opinion editor, Nigel Hannaford, he was the chief speechwriter to Stephen Harper. And I said, how do you feel about going to battle with your old boss on this? Because I feel like he's going to be our biggest problem. Stephen Harper, as a former Prime Minister of Canada, I cannot see any scenario where he's on the Alberta Nationalist side. I just don't see it. So Stephen Harper is going to be I mean, he's harder to rip down than a Nenshi or a Notley or even an Aaron O'Toole. He's an Albertan who is broadly supported. I think Stephen Harper is probably the greatest weapon in the arsenal of the Federalists here, followed closely by Pierre Poilievre. Some people said, "Oh yeah, maybe Poilievre." No, Poilievre is a Federalist. He's born and raised in Alberta, but he's spent most of his life in the East now as a member of Parliament, and he's a pan-Canadian Federalist. I 100% expect him to be on the other side of this debate. Those two guys are going to be far more dangerous opponents of the independence movement than Nenshi. Carney. If Carney's smart, he'll just go and hide in a bunker under Rideau Hall for the duration of this. If he comes and shows his face, then it's like, can you imagine the no side in the Quebec referendum sending Preston Manning into Montreal? It just wouldn't have been a good idea.
No. Well, yeah, I think there was some low-hanging fruit that Mark Carney could do that could at least help things to that end. But no, he's not going to persuade people. On the other side, though, the persuasion to leave. Preston Manning, he's been pretty outspoken on this. He seems kind of like maybe that person, but do you think potentially there's others out there?
I do. In some cases, I'm not at liberty to discuss. In other cases, I could can speculate. One of the problems, and I'm sure I'm not the first person to observe this, is that former politicians are a lot braver than sitting politicians. There's a lot less to lose. Yeah. So I think it's very likely we're going to see formerly elected politicians stand up and be some of the lead spokesmen of this, whereas the currently sitting politicians, for the most part, they want to keep their job. It's just such a big thing to stick your neck out on. One thing I am finding interesting, though, is putting together the debate here. I'm having trouble finding a Conservative MP who wants to debate on the Federalist side. They don't want to debate on the independent side, but they also don't want to stand up and be counted as I'm the stick out the Liberals for another 4 years, guys. It's interesting. I think as we get closer, the role of the Federal Conservatives caucus in Alberta and potentially Saskatchewan is going to be very interesting in this. Mm-hmm. In their hearts, a lot of them are pretty sympathetic, if not outright already there. But they're not the Bloc Rednecquois. They are the Conservative Party of Canada. They're sitting as Federalist MPs. If they want to speak out on this, you got to form your own party or sit as your own caucus or something like that at this point. It's hard to see how you can remain in a Federalist federal party and support independence. So it'll be interesting how it plays out with those guys, because Alberta Conservative MPs have a pretty cushy, safe job for life as long as you don't rock the boat, and this would be rocking the boat to the point where you're out.
Interesting indeed. Much more is mentioned westernstandard.news. Derek, appreciate your perspective on all of this. Thanks so much for making some time for us here today.
My pleasure, and good luck with the new show.
Well, thanks again to Derek Fildebrandt, publisher of the Western Standard. Now, say what you will about them, but they've certainly got their finger on the pulse of those in Alberta who either want to separate or would consider doing so. I do think it's important for everyone else to at least understand where that's coming from, and hopefully we can approach it in a constructive way. But as I said earlier, it feels all very unpredictable right now, beyond what feels like an inevitable referendum. Maybe that's this year, maybe that's next year, maybe we vote on other issues on top of that, maybe we end up with an early election. Who knows at this point? I do want to let you know, by the way, coming up in our next episode, which will drop on Friday, we'll be chatting with Alberta NDP Naheed Nenshi about the state of affairs here in Alberta, how the Premier is handling the referendum and separatism issues, the upcoming by-elections, the recent session of the Alberta legislature, ongoing scandals and controversies, and much more. That's coming up Friday. But before we conclude this episode, we have one more interview to bring you. It's a look back at a very impactful and consequential Prime Minister, one whose time in office has some very relevant lessons for today's Canadian leaders. Let's look at John Diefenbaker's journey. It's a look at John Diefenbaker's journey from humble beginnings to becoming Canada's 13th Prime Minister. But there's a particular focus on his role in standing up for individual freedoms and ushering in the Canadian Bill of Rights. Also explores how Diefenbaker stood up to pressure and interference from the Americans. Bob Plamondon is a consultant, a board member, economist, an author, historian, and educator. His latest book is entitled Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker's Battle for Canadian Liberties and Independence, including, by the way, a foreword from none other than former Prime Minister Jean Chrétien. Bob Plamondon, great to have you with us here today. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much, Rob. Pleasure to be with you.
So let's talk about the timeliness of a book about Canada's 13th Prime Minister, why you believe John Diefenbaker is maybe as relevant as ever in some ways.
Well, he's more relevant now than when I started to do the research for this book. I certainly didn't expect that a belligerent president of the United States was talking about making Canada a 51st state and, launching a massive trade war against Canada. But, it's timely in the sense that John Diefenbaker always thought about Canadian nationalism and about its independence. And he came into office with the view that Canada should become more economically independent and launched a campaign right from when he came into office to divert 15% of our trade away from the United States and more towards Commonwealth countries. And, he quite famously had, grand battles with John F. Kennedy over foreign policy during the Cold War. So he showed how you could be a Canadian Prime Minister and stick up for Canadian independence and not be intimidated and assert our sovereignty. And he did so in the face of perhaps the most covert political interference in Canadian history by an American president, John F. Kennedy.
Let's expand on that because, we're seeing it today in a different way, maybe more overt with you got the president talking about Canada as the 51st state. What was Diefenbaker dealing with that at the time? What kind of a threat was Canada facing?
So Diefenbaker entered Parliament in 1940 and he became leader in 1956 and Prime Minister in 1957. And the dominant world issues at the time when he became Prime Minister was the Cold War. So here we had the threat of nuclear weaponry that had been acquired. Certainly the United States had it since the end of the Second World War, but there was a great Cold War going on with Russia. And we went through the Cold War crisis, we went through the Cuban Missile Crisis at the same time. So there were a lot of threats, and this was not something that was just experienced by foreign policy experts. If you were a Canadian at the time and you were in school, you were learning to duck and cover under your desk. Bomb shelters were being built. There was a tremendous amount of anxiety that existed across the land and certainly within political circles. And there was quite a debate going on in Canada at the time, going into 1962 and 1963, post the Cuban Missile Crisis, about whether there would be American-controlled nuclear weapons planted on Canadian soil. And John Diefenbaker was opposed to that, and a lot in his party, and certainly the Liberal Party, changed their positions to say that they were in favor of that. So that was one of the big debates that went on at the time. At the same time, Diefenbaker was promoting his northern vision and roads to resources and building up our infrastructure to access our mineral resources, oil and gas and forestry in the far north, in part to make the Canadian economy more resilient and more independent, more prosperous. And in fact, he succeeded. The infrastructure that he put in place against much opposition laid the foundation for our prosperity for a generation that followed. So those were some of the big issues. But John Diefenbaker himself was advocated for one Canada without hyphenated Canadianism, with a Bill of Rights that guaranteed the rights of individual Canadians, free of discrimination, which was ripe in Canada at the time, as well as supporting the rights of Indigenous people in Canada, unlike any prime minister before him, with the possible exception of Sir John A. Macdonald.
Well, see, this is an interesting point. I think maybe there's an assumption when we look back on previous prime ministers, even into Diefenbaker's era, that it was a less enlightened time and that these kind of issues, we look at it through today's lens in a lot of ways, I suppose. But as you say, this was about laying a foundation for what eventually I think became the Charter, the idea of protecting individual freedoms and the idea even of standing up for marginalized communities. We tend not to think of prime ministers of the past, including Diefenbaker perhaps, as championing that.
Well, I would say it was his leadership that put this on the map for Canadians. We'd gone through 2 world wars, and the rights of individual Canadians had been suppressed, throughout World War II. Certainly people of Japanese and German ancestry. And he had, which was not a political asset at the time, a Germanic surname, John Diefenbaker, that became the first prime minister of neither British nor French heritage, not only to become prime minister, but to serve in cabinet. And throughout his career as a lawyer, he was always defending minorities and supporting minority rights. And he believed that Canada could not achieve its true potential until every Canadian had an opportunity to participate equally in the Canadian dream without discrimination. And so he championed that. It was not something that the Tory party had traditionally stood for, and certainly the elites in the party were, they identified with his message, but they weren't leading with it. And so this led to the 1960 Bill of Rights, which is certainly a precursor to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. It didn't have the protection of being embedded in the Constitution, but it was a guide, an aspirational guide, and in fact, a guide to the Supreme Court about the laws that were on the books and being proposed, and whether they withstood the test of the Bill of Rights, and that is that they were not discriminatory in nature.
What kind of resistance was he encountering then from other parties, even from within his party? What kind of support did he have for that?
So I would say he had mild support. There weren't, great objections. There were no, warning signs. I would say that, the academic community dismissed the idea. And they didn't regard Diefenbaker highly in any event. I mean, he came out of poverty. He's from rural Canada. He didn't have an elite education. He ran a 2-3 person law office, got into Parliament, was always, defending those who were charged with capital crimes. And, so he was not a big money lawyer. And so they dismissed the Bill of Rights. Someone wrote that it provided great protection as long as you didn't live in any of the provinces, because it didn't apply to provincial legislation. And the Supreme Court at the time, it as a body, it was essentially mitigating in Canada disputes on jurisdiction between federal and provincial level. It didn't have the muscle of having this tool of a Bill of Rights and to be able to adjudicate whether, in fact, there were discriminatory provisions in the law or in how we treated individual Canadians. So this was new. It was conceptual, and it was born out of Diefenbaker's lifetime experience facing discrimination and thought, what we did in the Second World War and the War Measures Act as it existed at the time posed a threat to the rights of individual Canadians. And I think it's only through the Charter and thereafter, when we look at how that developed, that Canadians, I don't even think they give them much credit for it, but historians and those who look at the record will say this was a foundational piece of thinking and work that subsequent governments built upon.
Now, I guess originally he was born in Ontario, but this is essentially a prime minister coming out of the West, and we face regional tensions today. I would imagine there were some of those at the time. What kind of issues in that sense was he dealing with, and how much of an obstacle was that for him becoming prime minister?
So it was, he had run for the leadership on 2 occasions and was, beaten badly. He was, not taken seriously. He won on his 3rd trip, and I should add, he had run in 5 federal and provincial elections before ultimately winning in 1940. So imagine you go 0 for 5,
Yeah.
You step up one more time, he gets elected in 1940. And, he made great speeches because he had tremendous charisma and a great speaker And boy, when he had you in his sights, he rarely missed the mark. So the Canadians and those in the Conservative Party, rank and file, saw him as someone who was, charismatic and visionary and someone who they could get behind. But the elite in his party, those from, Bay Street and from the city centers, thought that he was, a madman and a buffoon and a cartoon character. So he faced all of that. And when he ultimately won in 1956, there was a Stop Diefenbaker campaign by the party elites. And eventually they said, well, if the crazy son of a bitch wants to have it, let him have it. He'll only be there for one election and he'll be gone. It's the people who want John Diefenbaker, and and this is a quote I'm giving you, there's no sense in kicking against the pricks because, they want him. And so they kind of let him have his one shot, thinking that he would lose. And to their great surprise, after the Tories had won one of the previous 9 elections, he won in 57, he won in 58, and he won in 1962. So he turned a party of losers into a party of winners.
Yeah.
That's not to say that even the elites in the party came to his side, because they were instrumental in the defeat of his government in 1963 from within his own party.
Let's circle back to a big issue from his time, and it relates to relationship with the United States, Canada's military, of course, the Avro era. And still to this day, I think people speculate about what happened to the Avro era. Did the Americans kill it? Was this a missed opportunity for Canada? It was a consequential decision by John Diefenbaker. But what do you make of what happened there?
Well, when I talk to people about Diefenbaker, that's the very first thing they bring up is the Avro era. It's the one thing they know about him. And so I did some extensive research, including new material that had been previously, unclassified or had been classified. So in 1956, the government of Saint Laurent, the Liberal government, had determined to cancel the Avro era. The Defense Department had determined to cancel the Avro era. The Canadian government of the bureaucracy, the Privy Council office, had determined to cancel the Avro era. And they didn't go forward with it because they thought it could play poorly into the 1957 election. So they had deferred the decision. So why had they made this conclusion? It was because the Soviet military threat at the time was not that there were going to be a bunch of bombers flying out of Russia, flying over Canada, getting ready to drop bombs on us and in the United States. The threat at the time was intercontinental ballistic missiles. So that's where we needed to make our investments. Second, the Avro era, we had only created a number of prototypes, and it was a beautiful flying machine. It traveled at great speeds, but it was only ever a prototype. It never flew with weapons, and it was incredibly expensive. It was 500 times more expensive than what was the original estimate. It had turned into a white elephant, and the project had been abandoned by its partners. There was no market for this plane anywhere. So, the only potential buyer or user were Canadian. It was completely uneconomic. And to suggest that John Diefenbaker, who was always wary of the United States, would cave into their pressure is a ridiculous assertion. And so, in fact, what the decision that the Americans made was not to buy the Canadian plane. That's all they said. There was no pressure applied. And Diefenbaker made the very tough call to cancel this, and he knew it would, cost him politically. And it was, and the ridings where the plane was being manufactured were held by conservatives. So this was no gift to him politically. But that didn't stop. For example, the CBC did this massive fictionalized documentary of sorts on the Avro era that was their highest ranked documentary of all time. And you'd think CBC is in the nation building business. Well, in this case, they were in the slander business, and they were trying to take Diefenbaker down. So there is no objective evidence that states that Diefenbaker caved on this, or he didn't make a decision that was in the best interest of Canada and its national defense.
What is interesting, given that to some extent, just the fact that this is a conservative icon or a former conservative premier. I noted at the beginning, you've got Jean Chrétien, who's written the foreword to this book, which is interesting. What does that say about John Diefenbaker's legacy, or what does it say about kind of the cross-party maybe lessons that can be drawn from his legacy?
So Jean Chrétien was in the House of Commons when John Diefenbaker was there. And in fact, he came in just at the tail end of the Diefenbaker government, and John Diefenbaker sat in the House of Commons until he died in 1979. So there was an overlap there. And I think, Jean Chrétien has this view that you have political opponents and you don't have enemies. And he could respect John Diefenbaker as a man of the House of Commons and as someone who cared passionately about Canada and cared about individual rights. He didn't agree with John Diefenbaker on many, many issues. So this is not to say that he is supporting, his legacy. In fact, they almost came to blows over the flag debate, which the Liberal government was proposing, and John Diefenbaker opposed. So I think he had respect for Diefenbaker and his vision, and he has of the view that you can still respect your colleagues opposite, even though no one was more competitive in the House of Commons than Jean Chrétien and John Diefenbaker.
Well, I mean, it speaks
I'll add one other element.
Sure.
Jean Chrétien was the longest-serving minister of Indigenous and Indian and Northern Affairs, as they mm-hmm. call it, and he understood the respect and admiration that the Indigenous people had for John Diefenbaker and vice versa. So he saw that in action.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, it speaks to how long Jean Chrétien had been in politics. But what's unique about John Diefenbaker is how long he stayed in politics. You don't often see that, a prime minister who sticks around for years and years and continues to represent his riding in the House of Commons. He remained an MP well into the 1970s.
So it's not something I would recommend. It's not a favor you do to your successors in your party when you remain in the House of Commons. So, he stuck around as leader after losing in 63. He ran again in 65 and probably should not. And then, it was very difficult to extract from that position, which Bob Stanfield took over in 67. And Diefenbaker still kept his name on the ballot because he disagreed with the direction that Stanfield and others were taking the party. And then he remained in the House of Commons then after Stanfield came in, and then through to Joe Clark. And he died in 1979, not long after Joe Clark became prime minister. In fact, he said that Canada celebrated the International Year of the Child by electing Joe Clark as prime minister, which is sort of taking a bit of a shot at Clark's youthfulness. But he also took shots at Pierre Trudeau when Pierre Trudeau was 51 and married 22-year-old Margaret Sinclair. He congratulated the prime minister on his marriage, and he said, well, he had two choices. He could either marry her or adopt her. So he was, when Richard Nixon, who did not like Pierre Trudeau, famously called Pierre Trudeau an asshole, Diefenbaker defended Trudeau to say that, foreign leaders should not be criticizing a Canadian prime minister sticking up for Canadian sovereignty, but then added Richard Nixon had demonstrated an excellent knowledge of human anatomy. So, he could still deliver thunderbolts even when he was not leader, and, always was, quotable for the press. So, but I don't think that helped his successors or the party in the long term.
So we got a new prime minister who faces some pretty big challenges on his plate. We've got a conservative leader who came close to becoming prime minister, still hopes to. I would imagine both could maybe take something from this book or from Diefenbaker's time in office. What advice would you have, or what advice do you think the Dief would have for both of these gentlemen?
So John Diefenbaker, his last two election campaigns that he ran in 1963 and 1965, essentially his message was Canadians have a choice. And the choice is whether the policies respecting Canada would be made in Ottawa by the House of Commons and by parliamentarians, or whether they be made in Washington by a U.S. president. So he elevated that issue to the highest level, in part because the Americans were exerting a lot of pressure on Canada through the Cuban Missile Crisis, through the nuclear missiles on Canadian soil, through American intervention in Canadian trade policy. Canadians were trading with the Chinese with wheat. They were trading with Cuba after the Cuban Missile Crisis. So he put that issue front and center. And the lesson from from John Diefenbaker is that there's few issues that are more important than Canadian sovereignty. And so, he led with that. And there's lots of examples of his interactions with American presidents in this book and the relations with the United States that I think will remain instructive, not just for today, but for years to come, because the Canadian-American dynamic is something always to be very careful about.
Yeah. Well, timely and fascinating look into the life of a very consequential and important Canadian Prime Minister. The book is called Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker's Battle for Canadian Liberties and Independence. There it is right there. Much more at AristotleFoundation.org. Bob, congrats on this and really great conversation. Thank you so much for making some time for us here.
It is from Aristotle, but it is available everywhere. So you can get it on Amazon and Indigo and all bookstores. So I hope your viewers and listeners have a chance to get a read of the book.
Thanks again to Bob Plamondon. His new book is called Freedom Fighter, John Diefenbaker's Battle for Canadian Liberties and Independence, available now. Well, that's pretty much going to do it for this debut episode of the new podcast. Again, thanks so much for listening and downloading and being a part of this new endeavor. We'll have a new episode for you coming up on Friday, which, again, you can find at our Substack page, robbreakenridge.ca, as well as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and other podcast platforms. We'll also have episodes to listen to and interviews to watch at our YouTube page, so you can find us there as well. You can reach me at rob.breakenridge@gmail.com or on our website, again, robbreakenridge.ca. Thanks so much for joining us here today. We'll talk to you later this week. Take care.